the scent of expensive leather, and danger walked through the door at exactly 9:15. Zara Washington had been waiting tables at Celestial Heights for 3 years, long enough to recognize the subtle shift in atmosphere when certain kinds of power entered the room. She paused in her careful arrangement of crystal stemware, dark eyes tracking the movement of the man in the charcoal suit who commanded attention without saying a word. Have you ever noticed how some people just change the entire energy of a space the moment they arrive? I'd love to hear from viewers watching tonight where you're tuning in from, because I bet you've experienced this same feeling of recognizing danger wrapped in expensive clothes, whether you're in New York, Los Angeles, or anywhere else in the world. The restaurant's usual evening murmur dropped to a respectful whisper as Min Jun Kong moved through the dining room like a force of nature contained in Italian silk. His presence filled the sterile elegance of the establishment, transforming the neutral space into something electric with unspoken threat. Zara watched him settle into the corner booth, the one that provided clear sight lines to every entrance and exit, and felt her trained instincts sharpen to alertness. She had seen dangerous men before. Growing up in Detroit had taught her to read the signs, to recognize the controlled stillness that spoke of violence held in perfect check. But this man was different. Where street danger was raw and immediate, his threat was refined, sophisticated, wrapped in the kind of wealth that made people look away rather than challenge. The way he moved suggested years of combat training hidden beneath the veneer of corporate respectability. His dark hair was perfectly styled, his face carved with the kind of sharp angles that spoke of Korean ancestry mixed with something harder, something forged by choices that left marks on a man's soul. 2 other men flanked him at a discreet distance, their positions carefully chosen to watch the room while maintaining the illusion of casual dining. Bodyguards, Zara realized, though they wore their suits like armor and carried themselves with the same predatory grace as their employer. The entire choreography spoke of a world where dinner reservations required tactical planning. The maitre d' approached their table with the kind of deference usually reserved for heads of state, and Zara caught fragments of conversation in rapid Korean, punctuated by the occasional English phrase that suggested business rather than pleasure. She moved closer under the pretense of refreshing water glasses at nearby tables, her curiosity overriding her usual policy of staying invisible around the kind of clientele that could afford Celestial Heights prices. Min Jun's voice, when he finally spoke in English, was surprisingly warm for such a cold face. He possessed the kind of controlled baritone that suggested he was accustomed to being obeyed without raising his tone. There was something almost hypnotic about the careful precision of his words, each syllable measured and delivered with the confidence of a man who had never needed to repeat himself. The evening progressed with clockwork precision until the moment everything shattered. Zara was delivering the wine selection to table 12 when she noticed the new arrivals. 3 men in dark suits that didn't quite fit properly, their movements lacking the fluid grace of Min Jun's security team. They requested a table with suspicious urgency, their eyes scanning the room with the kind of focused intensity that made her skin crawl. Something about their positioning felt wrong, too coordinated, too purposeful. She was refilling water glasses when she saw one of them slip something into the wine bottle destined for Min Jun's table. Time slowed to crystalline clarity. Every detail burned itself into her memory with perfect resolution. The way the man's fingers trembled slightly as he added the colorless liquid. The satisfied smirk that crossed his face as he stepped away from the service station. The casual manner in which he signaled his companions with a subtle nod. Zara's medical training from her abbreviated nursing program kicked in with automatic precision. Whatever they had added to that wine was not meant to enhance the vintage. Her mind cataloged possibilities with clinical detachment while her heart hammered against her ribs. Poison. Had to be poison, and from the careful measurement, something that would work quickly but not immediately. She watched in frozen horror as the wine was delivered to Min Jun's table with ceremonial flourish. The sommelier performed the traditional tasting ritual, declaring the vintage exceptional, completely unaware that he was serving death disguised as hospitality. Minjun lifted the glass with the same controlled precision he applied to everything else, and Zara found herself moving before conscious thought caught up with instinct. The crystal glass was halfway to his lips when she collided with his table. Water cascaded across the white linen, sending the wine glass flying in a spectacular shower of burgundy liquid and shattered crystal. The entire dining room froze in collective shock as Zara found herself sprawled across Minjun's lap, her dark skin stark against his pale shirt, her breath coming in sharp gasps as she realized what she had just done. "Please save me," he whispered against her ear, so quietly that only she could hear. The words hit her like physical blows. This dangerous, powerful man who commanded rooms with his presence was asking her, a waitress from Detroit, to save his life. His dark eyes held hers with desperate intensity, and she saw something that transformed her understanding completely. Beneath the controlled exterior, beneath the expensive suit and the aura of lethal competence, Minjun Kong was just a man who wanted to live. The three poison-wielding men were already moving, their careful positioning revealed as the trap it had always been. Minjun's bodyguards were reaching for concealed weapons, but their movements seemed sluggish, wrong. Drugged, Zara realized with clinical clarity. The entire security team had been compromised, leaving their employer vulnerable and alone in a room full of witnesses. "Help me," Minjun breathed, his voice barely audible over the growing chaos. Zara Washington had exactly 3 seconds to decide whether to run for her life or save a stranger who might be the most dangerous man she would ever meet. In those 3 seconds, she looked into his eyes and saw something that made the choice inevitable. Whatever else he might be, whatever dark world he inhabited, he was asking for her help with the kind of desperate honesty that cut through every barrier she had built around her heart. She grabbed his hand and pulled him toward the kitchen, gambling everything on the hope that she could outrun death long enough to figure out how to cheat it. The industrial kitchen of Celestial Heights became a battlefield where life and death measured themselves in seconds. Zara dragged Minjun through the swinging doors as chaos erupted behind them, her mind racing through the limited medical knowledge she had absorbed during her 2 years at Wayne State before financial reality forced her to abandon nursing school for restaurant work. The poison had been colorless, odorless, added in a measured dose that suggested professional knowledge rather than amateur desperation. Whatever they had used was designed to work quickly but not immediately, allowing time for the perpetrators to establish alibis while their targets succumbed to what would appear to be a heart attack or stroke. Minjun's face was already showing the telltale flush of systemic distress, his normally controlled breathing becoming shallow and rapid. Zara pressed her hand against his forehead and felt the fever building beneath his skin like an engine overheating. His pulse, when she found it at his wrist, was racing toward dangerous territory. "Water," she commanded, pointing toward the industrial sink. "We need to flush your system immediately." Minjun moved with the disciplined efficiency of a man accustomed to following tactical orders, even as his body began to rebel against the foreign chemicals coursing through his bloodstream. He drank glass after glass of cold water while Zara rifled through the kitchen's first aid supplies, her hands moving with practiced competence despite the adrenaline singing through her veins. The restaurant's head chef, Marcus, burst through the doors with wild eyes and flour-covered hands, demanding to know what kind of disaster was unfolding in his domain. Zara grabbed his arm with fingers that left white pressure marks on his dark skin. "I need activated charcoal," she said with the kind of authority that brooked no argument. "The health food store 2 blocks down. Run. Now. And call my friend Rachel at Detroit General. Tell her Zara needs emergency toxicology advice, and she needs it 5 minutes ago." Marcus disappeared without question, responding to the unmistakable tone of someone who knew exactly what they were doing in a crisis. Minjun watched this interaction with sharp attention despite his body's distress, filing away the information that this waitress possessed both medical knowledge and the kind of command presence that could mobilize resources under pressure. Through the kitchen's small windows, they could hear sirens approaching, the wail of emergency vehicles cutting through the urban night like mechanical screams. Police, paramedics, possibly federal agents responding to what would undoubtedly be classified as an attempted assassination of a high-value target. The kind of incident that would generate paperwork, investigations, and the sort of media attention that made dangerous people even more dangerous. My security team will be here within minutes. Min-jun managed between careful sips of water, his voice strained but still carrying that undertone of absolute certainty. You saved my life. That makes you either extremely valuable or extremely dead, depending on how this situation resolves itself. The brutal honesty in his statement hit Zara like cold water to the face. She had acted on instinct, responding to a desperate plea for help without considering the broader implications of involving herself in whatever deadly game was being played around Min-jun's life. Now, as the reality of her situation crystallized with terrifying clarity, she realized that her moment of compassion might have irrevocably altered the trajectory of her entire existence. The kitchen doors exploded inward with military precision as Min-jun's backup security team arrived like a force of nature in expensive suits. 6 men moved with coordinated efficiency, establishing a perimeter and assessing threats with the kind of professional competence that suggested extensive training in protecting high-value assets. Their leader, a man with silver hair and eyes like winter storms, approached Min-jun with the careful respect of someone reporting to a superior officer. Package secure, he announced in accented English that suggested Eastern European origins. Hostiles neutralized. Local authorities contained. Medical team standing by for immediate extraction. Min-jun's transformation from poison victim to commanding authority happened with startling speed. Despite the toxins still working their way through his system, he straightened into the posture of a man accustomed to making life and death decisions for others. His dark eyes swept the kitchen before settling on Zara with an intensity that made her feel simultaneously protected and trapped. She comes with us, he stated with the kind of finality that suggested the decision was already made. Miss Washington is now under my protection. The words landed in the space between them like a contract written in invisible ink, binding her to a future she had never imagined. Zara felt the weight of that declaration settle around her shoulders like a cloak made of golden chains, beautiful and imprisoning in equal measure. I didn't ask for protection, she replied, her voice steady despite the chaos swirling around them. I have a life, a job, responsibilities that don't involve whatever world you come from. Min-jun studied her with the same careful attention he had given the wine before she knocked it from his hands, as if she were a puzzle requiring precise analysis. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of absolute certainty backed by resources she could barely imagine. The men who tried to kill me tonight saw your face, he said with brutal simplicity. They know you prevented their success. In approximately 6 hours, they will receive confirmation that I survived their attempt. Within 12 hours, they will have identified you as the variable that disrupted their plan. By tomorrow evening, you will be marked for elimination unless you accept my protection. The logic of his argument was as inescapable as it was terrifying. Zara had inserted herself into a deadly equation where the only solutions involved either his protection or her death. The choice, when stripped of all illusions, was between freedom that would last perhaps 24 hours and captivity that might keep her alive indefinitely. Marcus returned with the activated charcoal and Rachel's hurried medical advice delivered through his cell phone, his eyes wide with the kind of shock that suggested he was beginning to understand the true nature of the evening's events. Min-jun consumed the charcoal mixture with the same methodical precision he applied to everything else, his color already beginning to improve as the toxins were absorbed and neutralized. The police arrived with the predictable chaos of an investigation that would find carefully sanitized evidence and witnesses who remembered very little about the evening's actual events. Min-jun's security team moved with the fluid efficiency of people who had managed similar situations before, creating layers of protection and misdirection that would ensure the official record bore little resemblance to the truth. Through it all, Zara found herself at the center of a storm she had never asked to weather, her normal life receding like a shore glimpse from a ship already committed to deep water. When Minjun's personal physician arrived with a medical kit that suggested access to hospital-level resources, she realized that this was not a temporary disruption, but a permanent alteration of everything she thought she knew about her own existence. The ride to Minjun's compound happened in a vehicle that cost more than most people's annual salaries, its interior appointed with the kind of luxury that whispered of power measured in millions rather than thousands. Zara sat in leather seats that probably required the sacrifice of entire herds of cattle, watching the city lights blur past bulletproof windows while trying to process the complete transformation of her circumstances. "You will be comfortable," Minjun assured her, as they traveled through neighborhoods that grew progressively more exclusive, eventually reaching gates that suggested fortification rather than mere privacy. "My staff will provide anything you require. Consider yourself my guest rather than my prisoner." The distinction felt academic when the gates closed behind them with the finality of a cell door sealing. The compound spread before them like a vision of wealth made manifest. All clean lines and perfectly manicured grounds that spoke of both taste and the resources necessary to maintain such perfection. It was beautiful in the way that expensive cages were beautiful, offering comfort in exchange for freedom. As they approached the main house, its windows glowing with warm light that promised sanctuary, Zara realized that her life, as she had known it, was over. Whether what came next would be better or worse remained to be seen, but there was no returning to the woman who had served wine and worried about rent payments. That woman had died the moment she chose to save a stranger's life, replaced by someone who would learn to navigate a world where protection and captivity were often indistinguishable from one another. 3 days into her captivity, Zara Washington discovered that luxury could be its own kind of prison. The guest suite Minjun had provided was larger than her entire Detroit apartment, appointed with furniture that probably cost more than she made in a year. Egyptian cotton sheets, a bathroom with marble surfaces that gleamed like mirrors, and a walk-in closet that had been mysteriously stocked with clothing in her exact size. Every comfort imaginable, except the freedom to leave. She established routines because routines kept her sane. Morning coffee on the private balcony overlooking gardens that looked like they belonged in architectural magazines. Afternoon reading in the library that contained more books than some public branches. Evening walks through the compound's secure perimeter, always accompanied by discreet security personnel who maintained the illusion that she was a guest rather than a protected asset. Minjun moved through his domain like a shadow king, conducting business with the kind of quiet efficiency that suggested vast networks operating beneath the surface of legitimate enterprise. She caught glimpses of him in his study, speaking rapid Korean into encrypted phones, his voice carrying the weight of decisions that affected lives and fortunes across multiple continents. The man who had begged for her help in the restaurant seemed like a fever dream compared to this controlled force of nature who commanded respect through presence alone. On the 4th morning, she found him in the kitchen at dawn, standing motionless before the coffee machine with the peculiar stillness of someone fighting internal battles. His normally perfect composure showed hairline cracks, subtle signs of strain that spoke of sleepless nights, and the kind of stress that carved lines around man's eyes. The residual effects of the poisoning, she realized, were more persistent than he wanted anyone to know. The muscle tremors were so slight that only someone with medical training would have noticed the way his left hand occasionally spasmed against his will. His breathing, while controlled, carried an underlying irregularity that suggested his cardiovascular system was still processing the assault of whatever toxin had been meant to kill him. Most telling was the careful way he moved, as if sudden motion might trigger another wave of systemic distress. "You should be resting," she said, her voice carrying the authoritative tone she had learned during her abbreviated nursing training. "Whatever they gave you is still working its way through your system. Your body needs time to heal." Minjun turned toward her with the measured precision of a man accustomed to hiding weakness, but she caught the flash of vulnerability before his professional mask slid back into place. In that unguarded moment, she saw past the dangerous exterior to something unexpectedly human underneath. "I cannot afford to show weakness," he replied, his accent more pronounced than usual, suggesting fatigue or stress eroding his careful control. "My enemies interpret rest as opportunity." Zara moved toward him with the confident steps of someone approaching a wounded animal, careful but unafraid. She had seen enough sick people to recognize the stubborn pride that often prevented healing, the masculine refusal to acknowledge physical limitations that could turn minor injuries into major complications. "Sit down," she commanded, pointing toward the kitchen island with its array of expensive bar stools. "Let me check your pulse and blood pressure." Medical assessment, not personal concern. The distinction was a lie, and they both knew it, but it provided him the psychological cover necessary to accept help without losing face. Minjun settled onto the stool with careful control, his movements economical, but betraying the effort required to maintain his usual fluid grace. Zara's fingers found his pulse point at the wrist, her dark skin contrasting sharply with his pale complexion as she counted heartbeats with clinical precision. His pulse was elevated but steady, suggesting residual stimulants in his system rather than immediate danger. When she moved to check his lymph nodes, her touch was professional and impersonal, but she felt the subtle tension in his muscles that spoke of a man unaccustomed to allowing anyone close enough to assess his vulnerabilities. "You have good hands," he observed, his voice carrying an undertone she couldn't quite identify. "Steady, confident. You would have made an excellent nurse." The words hit her like an unexpected blow, reopening wounds she had carefully sealed years ago. Her abandoned dreams, sacrificed on the altar of family responsibility and financial reality, suddenly felt fresh and raw in her chest. "I want to be a trauma nurse," she admitted, the confession slipping out before she could stop it. "Emergency medicine. I completed 2 years at Wayne State before my mother got sick, and the bills made continuing impossible." Minjun studied her with the same careful attention he gave everything else, but this time his focus felt different, more personal than analytical. She saw something shift in his dark eyes, a recognition that suggested he understood the weight of dreams deferred for duty. "What stopped you from returning after your mother recovered?" The question exposed the heart of her disappointment with surgical precision. Zara felt the familiar ache of opportunity lost, of a path abandoned that had never quite stopped calling to her. "She didn't recover," Zara said quietly. "Cancer. By the time she passed, I had accumulated too much debt to return to school. The restaurant job was supposed to be temporary, just until I could save enough to go back. That was 3 years ago." Minjun's response was silence, but it was the kind of thoughtful quiet that suggested he was processing her revelation with the same strategic mind he applied to business problems. She had seen that expression before, usually right before he made decisions that rearranged other people's circumstances. The moment was interrupted by the arrival of his head of security, the silver-haired man she now knew as Victor, carrying a tablet that glowed with surveillance footage and threat assessments. The transformation in Minjun was immediate and complete, the vulnerable man disappearing behind layers of protective authority. "Report," Minjun commanded, his voice returning to the controlled tone that made rooms full of dangerous men listen carefully. Victor's briefing was delivered in the kind of coded language that revealed everything while saying nothing, but Zara caught enough to understand that her former life was being systematically monitored. Surveillance teams had been watching her apartment, her workplace, even her favorite coffee shop. The rival faction responsible for the poisoning attempt was casting a wide net, looking for any thread they could pull to unravel Minjun's security. "The restaurant received visitors last night," Victor reported, his accent thick with implications, asking questions about staff schedules, specifically about a certain waitress who left work early 3 days ago. Zara felt the blood drain from her face as the reality of her situation crystallized with terrifying clarity. She was not just under Minjun's protection. She was actively hunted by people who viewed her elimination as a tactical necessity. The compound walls that had felt like a beautiful prison suddenly seemed like the only thing standing between her and a violent death. Minjun's reaction was swift and decisive, the kind of controlled fury that suggested his enemies had made a critical error in threatening what he considered his responsibility to protect. His voice, when he spoke, carried the weight of absolute authority backed by resources that could reshape reality to match his will. Double the security detail on Miss Washington. I want eyes on every approach to this compound. And send a message to our competitors that their interest in my affairs has been noted and will be reciprocated with appropriate enthusiasm. The euphemism was polite, but the threat was unmistakable. Victor nodded with the satisfied expression of a man who enjoyed delivering consequences to people who made poor tactical decisions. After Victor left to implement these new security measures, Zara found herself alone with Minjun in the sudden quiet of the morning kitchen. The domestic space felt charged with unspoken tension. The ordinary act of sharing coffee transformed by the acknowledgement of the dangerous world swirling around them. "I am sorry," Minjun said, his voice carrying a weight that suggested he rarely offered apologies. "You deserve a normal life, not this existence of constant vigilance and protection protocols." His words held genuine remorse, the kind of regret that came from a man who understood the value of what he was asking her to sacrifice. But beneath the apology, Zara heard something else, a recognition that normal had become impossible the moment she chose to save his life. "Maybe normal is overrated," she replied, surprising herself with the honesty of the statement. "I spent 3 years serving people who never looked at me as anything more than part of the furniture. Here, at least, I feel like what I do matters." Minjun's smile, when it appeared, was like sunrise after a long night. It transformed his entire face, revealing glimpses of the man he might have been if different choices had shaped his path. For just a moment, the dangerous criminal mastermind disappeared, replaced by someone who looked remarkably like a lonely man grateful for unexpected companionship. "You matter more than you know," he said softly, the words carrying implications that sent warmth spreading through her chest like expensive wine. The moment stretched between them, delicate and charged with possibilities that neither was quite ready to acknowledge. Then Minjun's phone buzzed with urgent business, and the spell was broken, leaving Zara with a lingering awareness that something fundamental had shifted in the space between protection and something far more complicated. As he left to handle whatever crisis required his attention, Zara remained in the kitchen, staring out at gardens that looked like paradise but felt increasingly like home. She was beginning to understand that safety and captivity were not always opposite things, and that sometimes the most dangerous cage was the one you no longer wanted to escape. The call came at 3 in the morning, shattering the compound's carefully maintained peace with the electronic scream of Minjun's secure phone. Zara woke in her luxurious prison to the sound of rapid Korean echoing through the hallways, Minjun's voice carrying a lethal edge she had never heard before. Even without understanding the words, she recognized the tone of a predator receiving news that demanded immediate and violent response. She found him in his study, surrounded by multiple computer screens displaying surveillance footage, satellite imagery, and data streams that painted a picture of escalating threat with digital precision. His usually perfect composure had cracked completely, revealing something beneath that made her blood freeze in recognition of pure, controlled fury. "They took my sister," Victor reported, his accent thick with urgency. "Ambushed her car, leaving the hospital after a shift. Clean extraction, professional execution. They want to trade her for Miss Washington." The words hit Zara like physical blows, each syllable carrying implications that transformed her understanding of the stakes involved. These people had researched her life with surgical precision, identifying the one person whose safety mattered more to her than her own survival. Her younger sister Keisha, the nursing student who represented everything Zara had sacrificed her own dreams to protect, was now a pawn in a game she never should have been forced to play. "No," Minjun said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "The trade happens on my terms, at a location of my choosing, with conditions that guarantee Miss Washington's safety. Prepare the response teams." Zara stepped into the room with the kind of controlled determination that had carried her through every crisis of her adult life. The men turned toward her with expressions ranging from protective concern to professional assessment, but she focused entirely on Min Jun's dark eyes. "I'm going with you," she stated, her voice steady despite the terror clawing at her chest. "She's my sister, my responsibility. I won't hide behind these walls while she pays the price for my choices." Min Jun's reaction was immediate and predictable, the kind of masculine protective instinct that viewed her participation as an unacceptable risk to be managed rather than an asset to be utilized. His refusal was written in every line of his body before he spoke a word. "Absolutely not," he replied, his tone carrying the finality of someone accustomed to having his decisions accepted without argument. "You are the target they actually want. Delivering you to them defeats the entire purpose of this operation." Zara moved closer to his desk with the confident steps of someone who had spent years managing crises in hospital emergency rooms, her medical training providing the psychological framework necessary to function under extreme stress. She leaned forward, her hands flat against the expensive wood surface, her dark eyes holding his with unwavering intensity. "I know my sister better than anyone else alive," she said with the quiet authority of absolute certainty. "I know how she thinks, how she reacts under pressure, what she'll do to try to escape. You need that intelligence if you want this operation to succeed without getting her killed in the crossfire." The logic of her argument was inescapable, and she watched Min Jun process the tactical implications with the same analytical precision he applied to every strategic decision. Victor and the other security personnel maintained professional silence, while their employer weighed protection against operational effectiveness. Furthermore, Zara continued, pressing her advantage with the kind of calculated risk-taking that had saved Min Jun's life in the restaurant. "They're expecting you to treat me like a helpless victim to be protected. They won't be prepared for active resistance from someone they see as collateral damage." Min Jun studied her with the intensity of a man reassessing a fundamental assumption about the nature of the person under his protection. She saw the moment when his perception shifted, recognizing not just the waitress who had saved his life, but the intelligent, capable woman who had managed medical emergencies and family crises with equal competence. The planning session that followed revealed layers of Min Jun's operation that Zara had never imagined. Maps appeared on digital displays showing property layouts, escape routes, and tactical positions with military precision. Communication networks activated across multiple time zones, mobilizing resources that suggested influence extending far beyond simple criminal enterprise. Zara found herself at the center of strategic discussions that treated human life as a chess game played with lethal stakes. Her insights about Keisha's psychology and likely behavior patterns were integrated into assault plans with the same weight given to architectural blueprints and weapons deployment schedules. The warehouse they had chosen for the exchange squatted on the Detroit waterfront like a concrete tumor, surrounded by abandoned industrial infrastructure that provided both cover and isolation. Min Jun's advanced teams had been monitoring the location for hours, mapping every entrance and identifying the optimal positions for what he preferred to call protective intervention. Zara wore body armor that felt like being embraced by expensive, flexible steel, the weight both comforting and terrifying in equal measure. Min Jun had insisted on testing the communication equipment repeatedly, his protective instincts overriding tactical efficiency in ways that suggested his emotional investment in her survival exceeded professional obligations. The exchange was scheduled for midnight, that liminal hour when darkness provided cover for activities that daylight would expose to unwanted scrutiny. Zara crouched in the shadows beside Min Jun, close enough to smell the sandalwood and leather scent that had become inexplicably comforting, watching his transformation from businessman to predator with fascinated horror. This was Min Jun unleashed, stripped of civilized pretense, and revealed as something that belonged to humanity's evolutionary past. His movements carried the fluid grace of an apex predator stalking prey, every gesture economical and purposeful in ways that spoke of extensive training in violence as both art and science. Target acquired, Victor's voice whispered through their earpieces. 3 hostiles plus 1 package. Standard extraction protocols in effect. Zara's heart hammered against her ribs as she caught sight of Keisha through the warehouse's grimy windows. Her sister looked smaller than she remembered, more fragile, but her posture suggested defiance rather than defeat. Even under these circumstances, Keisha maintained the stubborn courage that had driven her to pursue nursing despite every financial and social obstacle. The initial approach went according to plan until the moment everything collapsed into chaos. The rival faction had prepared their own surprise. Additional personnel positioned to turn the exchange into an ambush that would eliminate both Zara and Minjun while keeping Keisha as insurance against future interference. What should have been a simple hostage trade became a firefight between professional killers in an environment that offered too much cover and too many angles of attack. Minjun moved through the warehouse like death given human form, his weapons appearing in his hands with the kind of casual competence that suggested thousands of hours of training. Each shot was precisely placed, each movement calculated to advance toward the objective while minimizing exposure to return fire. Zara watched him unleash violence with surgical precision, understanding for the first time the true nature of the power that had claimed her as its responsibility to protect. This was not merely criminal authority backed by money and influence, but predatory competence refined through years of surviving situations where hesitation meant death. The moment when everything changed came without warning or dramatic buildup. One of the rival gunmen had positioned himself with a clear shot at Minjun's back while he advanced toward Keisha's position. Zara saw the danger before anyone else, her medical training providing the enhanced pattern recognition that allowed her to process visual information faster than conscious thought. She moved without hesitation, her body acting on instincts she didn't know she possessed. The tackle that brought Minjun to the ground probably saved his life, but it also exposed them both to crossfire from multiple directions. The concrete floor was unforgiving against her armored body, but the sound of bullets passing through the space where Minjun's head had been provided immediate justification for her actions. His response was instantaneous and lethal, the kind of controlled violence that eliminated threats with mechanical efficiency. But in the aftermath, as silence settled over the warehouse like dust after an explosion, she saw something in his dark eyes that went beyond gratitude or professional appreciation. "You could have been killed," he said, his voice carrying an undertone of something that sounded remarkably like anguish. "Why would you risk yourself for me?" The question hung between them in the sudden quiet, heavy with implications that neither was quite ready to address directly. Zara looked into his face and saw past the dangerous exterior to something vulnerable and human underneath, something that had been wounded by her willingness to sacrifice herself for his survival. "Because someone has to save the people worth saving," she replied, the words carrying more meaning than she had intended to reveal. Keisha's rescue was accomplished with the kind of efficiency that spoke of extensive experience in extracting people from dangerous situations. But as they prepared to leave the warehouse, Zara realized that the real rescue had been mutual, each of them saving something in the other that they hadn't even realized was in danger. In the aftermath, as medical personnel checked Keisha for injuries and Minjun's security teams sanitized the scene, Zara found herself sitting in the back of an armored vehicle watching the man who had claimed her as his responsibility to protect. The careful control he maintained in all other circumstances had cracked completely, revealing something raw and unguarded underneath. "I cannot lose you," he said quietly, the admission torn from some deep place that he rarely allowed anyone to see. "You have become necessary to my existence in ways I do not fully understand." The confession hung between them like a bridge neither had expected to cross, beautiful and terrifying in its honesty. Zara realized that protection had transformed into something far more complicated, and that the cage she had accepted for safety had become something she no longer wanted to escape. The security briefing took place in Minjun's study at dawn, the morning light filtering through bulletproof windows to illuminate intelligence reports that painted a picture of decisive victory. Zara sat in the leather chair that had become her usual spot during these tactical discussions, watching Victor present evidence of the rival faction's complete dismantlement with the satisfaction of a man who appreciated thorough problem-solving. Photographs, financial records, and surveillance footage documented the systematic elimination of every person who had threatened her existence, their operations disrupted with the kind of comprehensive efficiency that ensured the problem would not resurface. Target eliminated, Victor reported, his accent thick with professional satisfaction. Primary leadership neutralized. Secondary command structure compromised. Financial networks seized. Remaining personnel have accepted integration into our organization or relocation to less competitive markets. The euphemisms were polite, but the reality was unmistakable. The people who had tried to kill Minjun and kidnap her sister no longer existed as an operational threat. Their elimination had been accomplished with the kind of thorough brutality that served as a warning to anyone else who might consider targeting what Minjun chose to protect. Miss Washington's security status has been upgraded to green, Victor continued, consulting his tablet with the careful attention of someone delivering good news that had been hard-earned. No active threats detected. Surveillance networks indicate normal operational environment. The words should have brought relief, but instead Zara felt something that resembled disappointment settle in her chest like cold stone. Green status meant safety. It also meant the end of any justification for her continued presence in Minjun's compound, the dissolution of the protection arrangement that had become her entire world. Minjun dismissed Victor with the kind of subtle gesture that moved mountains of human resources, leaving them alone in the study that smelled of leather and expensive coffee. The silence that followed was charged with unspoken implications, heavy with the weight of decisions that would reshape both their futures. "You are free to leave," Minjun said, his voice carrying the controlled neutrality of someone delivering news that cost him more than he wanted to reveal. "The threats against you have been permanently resolved. My protection is no longer necessary for your survival." The formal language felt like armor worn by someone trying to hide wounds, each carefully chosen word designed to provide her with the psychological space necessary to make an uncoerced decision. But Zara heard the undertone of loss beneath his professional composure, the sound of a man offering freedom while hoping desperately that it would be refused. She studied his face with the same careful attention she had once applied to medical assessments, looking for subtle signs that would reveal the emotional state he was working so hard to conceal. The tension in his jaw suggested pain being held in careful check. The way he avoided direct eye contact spoke of vulnerability he was unwilling to expose. Most telling was the stillness of his hands, usually so graceful in their movements, now held rigidly against the arms of his chair, as if motion itself might betray him. "Where would I go?" she asked quietly, the question carrying layers of meaning that extended far beyond simple geography. The words hung between them like a bridge she was afraid to cross, beautiful and terrifying in their implications. Minjun looked up at her then, his dark eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her feel simultaneously naked and protected. "Wherever you choose," he replied, his voice softening with something that sounded remarkably like tenderness. "I will ensure you have the resources to rebuild your life in whatever form brings you happiness. Medical school, if you still want that. A new identity, if you prefer to disappear completely. Anything you require to create the future you deserve." The offer was generous beyond anything she could have imagined, the kind of life-changing opportunity that most people only dreamed about. But as she sat in the morning light filtering through his bulletproof windows, surrounded by the luxury that had become familiar comfort, Zara realized that the future she wanted most was the one he was trying to give her permission to reject. "What if what I want is not to rebuild my old life?" she said, her voice carrying the kind of quiet courage that had driven her to save his life in a restaurant that now seemed like another lifetime. What if what I want is to build something entirely new, with someone who understands that safety and passion do not have to be mutually exclusive? Minjun's stillness was absolute, the kind of frozen attention that suggested a man afraid to move lest he disturb something precious and fragile. She watched emotions play across his features like shadows moving across water, hope and fear and desperate longing cycling through expressions he usually kept under perfect control. "You do not know what you are choosing," he said, his voice rough with the effort of maintaining distance, when everything in him wanted to close the space between them. "My world is dangerous. The enemies I have made will always view you as a weakness to be exploited. The life I can offer you is one of constant vigilance, where freedom must always be balanced against security." Zara rose from her chair with the fluid grace that had once carried her through hospital emergency rooms, moving toward him with the confidence of someone who had made an irrevocable decision. She placed her hands on the arms of his chair, leaning close enough to smell the sandalwood and danger that had become inexplicably necessary to her sense of home. "I am not afraid of your enemies," she said, her voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "I am afraid of a life without you in it. I am afraid of returning to a world where I feel invisible, where nothing I do matters beyond the immediate moment. You make me feel like I have a purpose worth protecting." His response was to reach up and cradle her face in hands that trembled slightly with the effort of restraining impulses that threatened to overwhelm his legendary self-control. His touch was reverent, careful, as if she were made of something precious that might shatter if handled too roughly. "You saved my life," he whispered, his voice carrying the weight of confession that had been building since their first moment together. "But you did more than that. You returned something to me that I thought I had lost forever. You made me remember what it feels like to have something worth protecting beyond mere survival." The kiss that followed was inevitable, the culmination of weeks of tension and unspoken longing that had been building between them like pressure behind a dam finally allowed to break. His lips against hers carried the taste of coffee and something darker, something that spoke of promises made in violence and kept through devotion. When they broke apart, both breathing hard from the intensity of connection finally acknowledged, Minjun rested his forehead against hers with the kind of intimate gesture that transformed warriors into lovers. "If you stay," he said, his voice raw with honesty, "it will be as my partner, not my protected asset. Your intelligence, your courage, your medical knowledge, all of it will be respected and utilized. You will have voice in decisions that affect our future. This will be a partnership between equals, not a protection arrangement between predator and prey." The distinction was crucial, the difference between captivity disguised as care and genuine collaboration built on mutual respect. Zara felt the last walls around her heart crumble as she realized that the cage she had feared had always been an open door, waiting for her to choose to walk through it as an equal rather than a prisoner. "I choose you," she said, the words carrying the weight of absolute commitment. "I choose this life, this danger, this partnership, but I choose it with conditions of my own." His smile, when it appeared, was like sunrise after the longest night, transforming his entire face from dangerous authority to something approaching joy. He waited with the patient attention of someone willing to negotiate terms with an equal partner. "I want to return to medical school," she continued, her voice steady with the confidence of someone stating non-negotiable requirements. "Not as your charity case, but as your partner investing in skills that will serve our shared future. I want Keisha to be protected and supported through her nursing program, because family protection extends both ways. And I want honesty, complete honesty about the nature of your business and the risks we face together." Minjun's response was to stand and draw her into his arms with the kind of possessive tenderness that spoke of a man claiming what he considered his most precious treasure. His embrace was warm and solid and safe in ways that made her understand why people built entire lives around the hope of finding such perfect sanctuary. Agreed, he said against her hair, his voice carrying the weight of vows made in ancient languages that predated modern concepts of law and order. You will have everything you require to become the woman you were meant to be. And in return, you will help me become the man worthy of your choice. The transformation of their relationship from protection to partnership was formalized not with documents or ceremonies, but with the kind of intimate understanding that passed between two people who had seen each other at their most vulnerable and chosen to build something beautiful from the wreckage of what they used to be. As morning gave way to afternoon, they planned their shared future with the same strategic precision Minjun applied to business operations. Medical school applications, security protocols for Keisha, integration of Zara's insights into the legitimate aspects of his empire. Every detail was negotiated and agreed upon with the care of people building something meant to last through whatever storms might come. The claiming, when it finally happened, was mutual and absolute, the kind of spiritual and physical union that transformed two incomplete people into something stronger than the sum of their individual parts. In the sanctuary of his bedroom, surrounded by windows that looked out over gardens that no longer felt like prison walls, Zara surrendered to a man who had already surrendered everything to her. Their lovemaking was gentle and fierce by turns, each touch carrying the weight of promises made and kept, each caress an acknowledgement of the courage required to choose love over safety, partnership over protection, danger shared over security lived alone. In the aftermath, as they lay entwined in sheets that smelled of sandalwood and satisfied desire, Zara realized that she had found something worth more than the safety she had originally sought. She had found a home in the arms of a dangerous man who had proven that the most terrifying cage could become the most beautiful sanctuary when entered by choice rather than circumstance. 6 months later, Zara Washington Kong stood in the marble foyer of what had once been her beautiful prison, now transformed into something that felt remarkably like home. The compound had evolved under her influence, subtle changes that reflected the integration of two worlds previously kept separate by necessity and design. Medical texts now shared shelf space with business journals in Minjun's study. The industrial kitchen had been redesigned to accommodate her love of cooking, the space where she had once saved his life now serving as the heart of their shared domestic existence. Her morning routine included reviewing case studies for her accelerated medical program, the textbooks spread across the dining table that had once seemed too grand for ordinary use. Wayne State had welcomed her return with the kind of enthusiasm usually reserved for students whose academic records were backed by substantial endowment contributions. The fact that her education was funded by sources that preferred anonymity seemed to concern no one in the administration. Minjun emerged from his study, carrying coffee and wearing the satisfied expression of someone who had just concluded business that would reshape entire markets in favorable directions. His transformation over the past months had been as dramatic as her own, the controlled predator softening into something that resembled happiness without losing any of his essential competence. The morning briefing indicates our final loose end has been permanently resolved, he announced, settling beside her with the kind of casual intimacy that had replaced their former careful distance. Chen's organization has accepted our acquisition offer. Their territories will be integrated into our legitimate operations by the end of the quarter. The euphemisms had become familiar, the polite language that described the transformation of criminal enterprises into legal businesses through applications of strategic pressure and financial incentives. Minjun's empire was evolving under her influence, becoming something that generated wealth through commerce rather than violence, though the capacity for protection remained absolute when circumstances required decisive action. Keisha arrived for their weekly lunch with the kind of confident energy that spoke of someone thriving under circumstances that provided both challenge and security. Her nursing program was progressing with exceptional speed, her natural intelligence enhanced by access to resources that most students could only dream about. The private tutoring, the connections to prestigious medical facilities, the opportunities for hands-on experience in trauma centers where her skills could develop under expert guidance. I received my placement for the emergency medicine rotation, Keisha announced, her smile bright enough to power the entire compound. Detroit General Trauma Unit, working directly with the chief resident who trained at Johns Hopkins. Zara felt pride swell in her chest as she watched her sister describe opportunities that had once seemed impossibly distant. The sacrifice of her own dreams had not been meaningless when it allowed Keisha to achieve everything that circumstances had denied to the older sister who had cleared the path. The wedding preparations had been a study in diplomatic complexity, the careful negotiation between cultures and expectations that require the kind of strategic planning usually applied to international treaties. Minjun's Korean heritage demanded certain traditional elements, while Zara's family brought their own requirements for what constituted proper celebration of such a significant union. The venue was the compound's gardens, transformed into something that looked like a fairy tale written by someone who understood that beauty was enhanced rather than diminished by the presence of discreet security measures. White silk and orchids created an environment that spoke of elegance and permanence, while the guest list included representatives from legitimate business enterprises and certain other organizations that preferred to conduct their affairs away from public scrutiny. Victor served as Minjun's best man, his silver hair gleaming in the afternoon sunlight as he performed the traditional Korean ceremonies with the kind of solemn attention usually reserved for matters of state security. The contrast between his dangerous competence and his careful handling of silk ribbons and ceremonial cups provided a visual metaphor for the transformation that had touched every aspect of their shared existence. Zara's dress had been designed by someone who understood that beauty and practicality were not mutually exclusive concepts, the flowing silk concealing the kind of subtle protective elements that ensured elegance would not compromise safety. She felt like a queen claiming her rightful throne. The transformation from protected asset to equal partner made manifest in white silk and promises that carried the weight of absolute commitment. The vows they exchanged were written in languages that predated modern concepts of marriage as social contract, speaking instead to the kind of spiritual and practical union that created dynasties rather than mere families. Minjun's voice, when he spoke the traditional Korean phrases, carried the weight of someone claiming what he considered his most precious treasure. Zara's responses were delivered in English that had been translated to carry equivalent meaning, her promise to stand beside him through whatever storms might threaten their shared future. The moment that sealed their union was not the exchange of rings or the formal pronouncement of marriage, but the look that passed between them as the ceremonies concluded. Recognition of the journey that had brought them from desperate strangers to partners in every sense that mattered, acknowledgement of the courage required to choose dangerous love over safe solitude. The reception that followed was elegant and subdued, the kind of celebration that allowed both business associates and family members to honor their union without creating situations that might compromise the delicate balance between Minjun's various professional obligations. Toasts were offered in multiple languages, each speaker acknowledging the transformation that had touched not just the couple, but the entire organization that now operated under the influence of someone who understood that strength and compassion were not contradictory concepts. As evening settled over the gardens like a blessing, Zara found herself standing beside her husband, watching their guests mingle with the kind of careful choreography that ensured everyone's comfort while maintaining appropriate security protocols. The word husband still felt new in her mind, carrying implications that extended far beyond legal or social definitions into something that spoke to the fundamental restructuring of her understanding of what partnership could accomplish. The final threat to their happiness had been eliminated not through violence, but through the kind of strategic thinking that transformed enemies into allies through applications of mutual benefit. The last rival organization had been offered terms that made cooperation more profitable than conflict, their leadership integrated into the expanding network of legitimate enterprises that now generated wealth through commerce rather than conquest. Minjun's business empire was evolving into something that could withstand public scrutiny, the kind of diversified conglomerate that employed thousands of people in industries ranging from technology to healthcare to international logistics. The transformation was gradual but inevitable, guided by someone who understood that sustainable power was built on foundations that served community interest rather than merely personal profit. Late that night, as they prepared for bed in the master suite that had witnessed their transformation from strangers to lovers to partners, Zara caught sight of herself in the mirror that reflected both their images back with crystalline clarity. The woman looking back at her bore little resemblance to the waitress who had served wine and worried about rent payments, replaced by someone who carried herself with the confidence of a person whose choices had consequences that reshaped reality. "Do you ever regret it?" Minjun asked, his voice carrying the quiet vulnerability that he now allowed her to see without protective armor. "Choosing this life instead of the safety you could have had." Zara turned toward him with the kind of fluid grace that had once carried her through hospital emergency rooms, now serving to bridge the space between two people who had built something beautiful from the wreckage of what they used to be. She placed her hands against his chest, feeling the steady heartbeat that had become the rhythm by which she measured her own sense of home. "I regret nothing," she replied, her voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty that had guided her through every major decision since the night she chose to save his life. "You taught me that the most dangerous cage can become the most beautiful sanctuary when entered by choice rather than circumstance." Their future stretched before them like an uncharted territory filled with possibilities that neither could have imagined when they first met in a restaurant that now seemed like another lifetime. Medical school would provide her with skills that would serve their shared interests in healthcare ventures. His business empire would continue evolving toward legitimacy while maintaining the capacity for protection when circumstances required decisive action. The children they would raise together would inherit both strength and compassion, learning to navigate a world where power and responsibility were inseparable concepts. The legacy they would build would extend far beyond personal happiness into something that served communities and created opportunities for others who deserved better than the circumstances they had been born into. As they settled into sleep, surrounded by walls that had once felt like prison barriers, but now provided sanctuary against a world that could be harsh and unforgiving, Zara realized that she had found something worth more than the safety she had originally sought. She had found a partnership that transformed two incomplete people into something stronger than the sum of their individual parts. The last thought that crossed her mind before sleep claimed her was the recognition that sometimes the most terrifying leap of faith led not to destruction, but to the kind of love that could reshape entire worlds through the application of mutual devotion and shared courage. In the morning, they would wake as partners in every sense that mattered, ready to face whatever challenges their chosen future might bring with the confidence of people who had already survived the most dangerous test of all, the courage to choose love over safety, partnership over protection, dangerous happiness over safe solitude. What moments in your own life have required that kind of terrifying courage to choose love over safety? Have you ever found that the most frightening decision led to the most beautiful outcome? I'd love to hear about your own experiences with taking leaps of faith for love, because sometimes the most powerful stories are the ones we create in our own lives rather than just the ones we hear about others.